Maya Mercer stood perfectly still, a vision of quiet elegance in the opulent hotel suite. Her pristine white gown pooled around her, a confection of silk and lace that had taken months of careful planning and sacrifice. She was 25, a meticulous corporate event planner from a modest background, and she had been raised to keep the peace, to always smooth things over. Today, she was supposed to become Mrs. Julian Thorne, a name whispered with a certain reverence in London's elite circles, a name that promised a life far removed from her humble beginnings. Yet, a knot of nervousness tightened in her stomach, less about the vows and more about the powerful, snobbish family she was about to join. She just wanted to be chosen loudly and proudly, to be someone's undeniable priority. The suite was too quiet, the air thick with anticipation. Her bridesmaids had gone ahead, leaving her a moment alone, a final breath before her life irrevocably changed. But Julian wasn't there. He was supposed to be waiting, his smile the one thing that always calmed her. A sliver of unease, cold and sharp, pricked at her. It wasn't like him to be late, especially not today. Something felt off, a tremor beneath the perfect facade of her wedding day. She picked up her phone, a quick text to his best man. No reply. Her heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, a quiet intuition she'd learned to trust over years of managing complicated events. Discretion, her mother always said, was a woman's greatest asset, so Maya, with a deep breath, decided to discreetly search for him herself. Her silk slippers made no sound as she glided through the hushed corridors, past bustling staff and hushed guests. She checked the ballroom, the reception, even the small lounge where he sometimes smoked a cigar. Nothing. The unease morphed into a cold dread, a premonition of disaster. Then, a faint sound, a muffled laugh drew her towards a rarely used service corridor, a forgotten utility room tucked away near the kitchens. Her hand trembled on the cold metal handle. The door was ajar. What she saw ripped through her carefully constructed world like a hurricane. Julian, her Julian, was pressed against the wall, his crisp white shirt rumpled, his lips locked with those of another woman. A bridesmaid, Maya vaguely registered through the haze of shock, her own crumpled veil lying discarded on the floor nearby. The vibrant smear of lipstick on Julian's collar was a brutal, undeniable splash of color against the pristine white. It wasn't just a kiss, it was raw, unapologetic intimacy, a betrayal so stark it stole her breath. Humiliation, hot and searing, flooded her. All her carefully cultivated peace, her quiet elegance shattered into a million pieces. The dream of being chosen, of being someone's pride, dissolved into ash. Her hands flew to her mouth, stifling a cry that threatened to tear from her throat. Her heart convulsed with a pain so profound it stole her ability to breathe. There was no explanation, no excuse, only the undeniable, sickening reality of his infidelity. She couldn't stay. She couldn't face him, couldn't face the judgment, the pity, the public shame. The pristine wedding dress, a symbol of her dashed hopes, felt like a cage. She turned and fled, not caring where her feet took her, only that they carried her away from that room, away from him, away from the wreckage of her life. The delicate lace of her gown snagged on a stray nail in the corridor, then again on a sharp corner, tearing with a soft, ripping sound that mirrored the shredding of her soul. She barely noticed. She burst through the grand hotel doors, the cold London rain instantly soaking her hair, plastering strands to her face. It was a deluge, a fitting backdrop to the storm raging inside her. The beautiful dress, now ruined and muddy, clung to her, a constant heavy reminder of her public shame. She ran blindly, tears mixing with the rain, her vision blurred, her heart aching with a desperate, overwhelming need for shelter, for protection, for anything to shield her from the brutal exposure of her heartbreak. The weight of it all, the betrayal, the public spectacle, was crushing her, leaving her utterly exposed and alone in the vast, unforgiving city. The cold London rain was relentless, a stinging assault on Maya's exposed skin. Her breath hitched in ragged sobs, each one a fresh stab of pain. The shredded remnants of her wedding dress, once a symbol of dreams, now felt like a cruel mockery, heavy and sodden against her skin. She stumbled through the unfamiliar streets, her vision blurred by tears and the relentless downpour, the weight of public shame crushing her. There was no direction, no destination, only a desperate primal urge to escape the suffocating humiliation. She was utterly alone, adrift in a city that suddenly felt vast and unforgiving. Just as her legs threatened to give out, a sleek, black car, impossibly dark and silent, glided to a halt beside her. Its polished surface reflected the distorted city lights, a stark, impenetrable barrier against the chaos of the street. Maya flinched, her heart leaping into her throat, convinced it was Julian, come to drag her back to face his perfidy. But the door opened, not with a furious shout, but with an almost imperceptible click, revealing a figure that was infinitely more daunting. Viktor Volkov. He emerged from the car like a shadow extending itself, a towering, imposing man whose presence seemed to swallow the very light around him. His suit was as dark and flawless as the vehicle, completely untouched by the driving rain. His eyes, the color of frozen steel, swept over her, taking in her disheveled hair, her tear-streaked face, the ruined dress, and the utter despair etched into her features. There was no pity in his gaze, only a cool, assessing observation, as if she were a piece on a chessboard, observed with hawk-like precision. He had seen it all, she realized, with a fresh wave of mortification, her public breakdown, her frantic flight. Nothing escaped his icy scrutiny. Maya Mercer. His voice was a low, resonant rumble, cutting through the drumming rain and her own frantic thoughts. It wasn't a question, but a statement of absolute certainty, a sound that demanded attention and brokered no argument. Your fiancé made a mistake. She could only stare, shivering, unable to form words. The sheer audacity of his appearance, the chilling calm in his voice amidst her storm, rendered her speechless. He didn't offer comfort or solace, only an undeniable, unwavering presence that felt both terrifying and, in a strange, desperate way, like a magnet. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, making her feel impossibly small, vulnerable, and completely exposed. "Marry me instead," he stated, the words cold, precise, and entirely transactional. "Destroy them together." Maya's mind reeled. The absurdity of it, the sheer audacious proposal, should have made her laugh or scream. But the utter conviction in his tone, the unshakable authority in his eyes, held her captive. It was a cold offer, devoid of emotion, rooted in some dark rivalry she barely understood, yet it resonated with a part of her that craved justice, that longed for someone to fight for her, even if it was for his own motives. Destroy them together. The words whispered a promise of retribution, of an escape from the crushing weight of her public ruin. She had nothing left to lose, only a life shattered beyond repair. His offer, terrifying as it was, felt like an unexpected lifeline, a chance to be chosen, albeit for a purpose far removed from love. "Yes," she whispered, the single word barely audible over the rain, a surrender she hadn't known she was capable of. A strange calm began to settle over her, an intoxicating sense of release. She was giving up control, but in doing so she was also shedding the suffocating burden of her humiliation. Immediately, as if her quiet acceptance was the key, Victor's hand moved. A large black umbrella, as dark and imposing as he was, unfurled above her head, shielding her from the deluge. The sudden cessation of the pelting rain felt like a physical embrace, an undeniable act of protection. The cold still bit at her, but the immediate tangible barrier between her and the storm was profound. She felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in hours. Safety. It was a dark, dangerous kind of safety, born of command and absolute power, but it was safety nonetheless. He held the umbrella high, his gaze still fixed on her, and for the first time in her life, Maya felt undeniably, unequivocally protected, even by this terrifying, dominant stranger. He simply looked at her, then gestured subtly towards the open car door. The command was silent, but absolute. She obeyed, stepping out of the rain and into the dark, sleek sanctuary of his vehicle, leaving the wreckage of her past life behind. The sleek black car cut through the London night, a silent, powerful beast devouring the distance. Maya sat in the plush leather seat, the warmth of the interior a stark contrast to the icy rain she had just escaped. Victor sat beside her, a formidable presence, radiating an aura of absolute control. He hadn't spoken since her whispered yes, but his silence was more commanding than any shout. She felt his gaze on her sometimes, a brief assessing sweep that left her feeling utterly transparent, as if he could see the shattered pieces of her soul. Yet beneath the terror, a strange calm had settled. She had surrendered. And with that surrender, the crushing weight of her immediate despair had lifted. They didn't go to his home. Instead, the car glided into a discreet underground garage beneath a towering glass building in the heart of the city. Within minutes, she was ushered into a hushed, sterile office where stern-faced lawyers waited, their expressions unreadable. Documents, thick and formal, were placed before her. An ironclad prenuptial agreement, a marriage contract outlining her public duties, her financial future, and most crucially, her absolute discretion and public loyalty. Victor's voice, when it finally spoke, was low and unyielding. Read it, understand it, sign it. He didn't explain, didn't persuade, he simply commanded. Maya's eyes scanned the legal jargon, her mind still reeling, but the underlying message was clear. She was entering a binding agreement, trading one life for another, stepping into his world on his terms. There was no room for negotiation, no space for doubt. Her past, her previous life, was to be severed completely. A complete break from her past. The words echoed in her mind. It felt like being remade, stripped down and rebuilt according to his design. But as she gripped the pen, a flicker of defiance quickly gave way to a deeper, more primal instinct. This was the price of her new protection, the cost of the revenge she craved. She signed, her hand steady, sealing her fate with Viktor Volkov. Hours later, the sun was a faint promise on the horizon as the black car delivered her to Victor's penthouse. It wasn't merely an apartment, it was an entire floor, a kingdom suspended above the Thames. As the elevator doors opened, Maya stepped into a world of overwhelming opulence. Walls of glass offered panoramic views of London, the river a shimmering ribbon far below. The air smelled faintly of expensive wood and something indefinable, something cold and powerful. Marble gleamed, silk drapes cascaded, and art that looked priceless adorned every wall. It was a golden cage, she realized, breathtakingly beautiful and undeniably inescapable. Silent, efficient staff, dressed in impeccable uniforms, moved through the vast space, anticipating needs before they were even voiced. She met a stern-faced housekeeper, a quiet personal assistant, and then a security detail. 3 men, built like fortresses, their gazes sharp and watchful, were introduced as her constant shadows. They were everywhere, yet never intrusive, a silent, ever-present wall that made her feel both intensely observed and profoundly safe. This was his world, and she was now a part of it, a valuable possession to be guarded. Victor led her to a vast bedroom suite, larger than her entire previous apartment. He spoke few words, merely indicating the walk-in closet filled with exquisite new clothes, a stark contrast to her ruined wedding dress, now gone. "Rest," he ordered, his voice still that low rumble of authority. "Tomorrow, your new life begins publicly." And it did. The news broke with the force of a thunderclap. Maya Mercer, the jilted bride of Julian Thorne, was not only recovering, but was now engaged to Viktor Volkov, the notoriously private, fiercely powerful shipping magnate. The speed of it, the sheer audacity, sent shockwaves through London's elite. Her ex-fiancé's powerful family, who had likely expected her to quietly disappear, were now forced to witness her meteoric rise, her new status a direct, public humiliation. Victor placed a heavy, thick black wedding band on her finger, not a sparkling diamond, but a solid, unyielding band of obsidian-like metal. It wasn't a symbol of delicate love, but of possession, of a binding contract. Its weight was a constant, tangible reminder of her new identity, her new master, her new protection. Looking at it, Maya felt a complex mix of emotions. She was no longer just Maya Mercer, the girl from a modest background. She was becoming Mrs. Volkov, a name that would soon be whispered with awe and fear. In Victor's world, under his absolute protection, she was finally chosen, undeniably claimed, and undeniably safe. The revenge she knew had only just begun. The first few days in Victor's penthouse blurred into a new, disciplined rhythm. Maya's mornings began not with her own agenda, but with a meticulously detailed schedule discreetly placed by her bedside table. Every hour was accounted for. Language lessons with a patient tutor, intense etiquette training for high society, fittings for the endless array of couture Victor had curated for her. She felt like a doll, beautiful and expensive, positioned perfectly by a master hand. Her clothes, chosen by his stylists, were exquisite, luxurious fabrics, tailored lines, always understated yet undeniably powerful. They weren't her choices, but as she looked in the mirror, she saw a woman who commanded respect, a woman who belonged by Victor's side. It was a strange surrender, a quiet relinquishing of her own will, but with each meticulously planned day, a new, quiet order settled within her. Victor often appeared unexpectedly, his presence always announced by the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, the sudden, almost imperceptible straightening of his staff. His questions were direct, probing, about her lessons, her understanding of their public role, her comfort. Though he never asked about her feelings, only her compliance, his gaze, those icy eyes, would sweep over her, assessing her posture, her expression, her very readiness. Each time she felt a tremor, a primal response to his sheer dominance, but also a fierce desire to meet his unspoken expectations. When she answered correctly, when she moved with the grace he seemed to demand, a faint, almost imperceptible nod from him was her reward, a quiet acknowledgement that filled her with a strange, deep satisfaction. She realized he wasn't just observing. He was molding her, testing the strength of her resolve, the depth of her submission. The first corporate gala was a whirlwind of London's elite, a glittering, predatory world. Maya, dressed in a midnight blue gown that clung to her curves with elegant restraint, felt every eye on her, 1,000 silent judgments and curious whispers. But it was Victor who truly commanded the space. She watched him move, a dark, magnetic force among the shimmering crowd. His voice, when he spoke, was low but carried absolute authority. People leaned in, hung on his words, their faces a mixture of deference and barely concealed fear. She saw the subtle flinches, the quick reassessments when he entered a conversation. He wasn't just a powerful man, he was a force of nature, a predator at the top of his food chain. The ruthless undercurrents of his world, the silent battles for influence, were laid bare before her. Yet, his hand on her lower back, a light, possessive touch, was a constant anchor, a reminder that she was with him, untouchable under his formidable protection. Walking by his side, feeling the sheer weight of his power, a profound shift began within Maya. Initially, she had felt like a pawn in his game, a tool for his revenge. But as she observed the way others quailed before him, the way his enemies visibly retreated from his path, she realized the undeniable security his absolute authority provided. He was demanding, yes, and his methods were cold. But for the first time in her life, she felt truly, undeniably chosen and protected. There was a quiet comfort in knowing that he managed everything, that his strength was her shield. She didn't have to fight, didn't have to defend herself. She just had to exist under his formidable shadow, and in that existence, a strange, intoxicating peace began to blossom. His dominance wasn't just control, it was a promise, a guarantee that no one, absolutely no one, would ever hurt her again. And she found herself leaning into it, finding sanctuary in his unwavering, unyielding presence. The whispers began almost immediately, carried on the invisible currents of London's elite society. Maya, usually so adept at filtering out gossip, found herself acutely aware of the subtle shifts in conversation, the averted gazes, the sudden silences when she entered a room. Julian, her ex-fiancé, and his family were furious. She could feel their impotent rage, a distant but persistent hum, trying to claw its way into her new life. There were veiled attempts to smear her, subtle digs planted in society columns, hinting at her opportunism or questioning her character. A pang of the old anxiety, the fear of public judgment, tightened in her chest. For years she had striven for a flawless reputation, to be seen as respectable. And now, despite her new, powerful position, she felt a familiar vulnerability. Then came the call from her mother. Maya had expected, perhaps, some measure of comfort, a word of understanding for the humiliation she had endured. Instead, her mother's voice was laced with thinly veiled disappointment, a quiet lament for the lost social standing, the forfeited financial security that marrying a thorn would have brought. "Are you truly happy, darling?" her mother had asked. But the question wasn't about Maya's well-being. It was about the perceived cost of her defiance, the inconvenience of her new, formidable husband. Maya hung up, a fresh wave of heartbreak washing over her. It wasn't just Julian who had betrayed her. Her own mother, in her quiet way, had chosen the illusion of wealth over her daughter's pain. It was a stark, cold realization that left Maya feeling even more isolated, pushing her further into Victor's orbit. Victor, however, seemed entirely unfazed by the storm of rumors and social attacks. He moved through his world with an unshakable calm, a force of nature immune to petty squabbles. Maya didn't see him actively fighting these battles. She simply observed their disappearance. A snide online article about her past would be there one moment, gone the next, leaving no trace. A particularly cutting whisper about her humble origins would be met with a swift, subtle social countermove that left the instigator suddenly ostracized. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His actions were cold, efficient, and devastatingly effective. His security around her, already formidable, visibly tightened. The silent, watchful men who flanked her in public became even more prevalent, their presence a constant, unwavering wall. She felt intensely observed, every movement noted, every interaction scrutinized. But it wasn't a suffocating feeling. It was a profound reassurance. They were a physical manifestation of Victor's protective will, an impenetrable fortress built around her. No one could get to her. No one could touch her without first getting through them. It was a strange duality, the loss of personal freedom traded for an absolute, undeniable safety. One afternoon, Maya was in the vast living area, attempting to focus on an economics textbook Victor had provided, when she overheard his conversation in his study. The door was slightly ajar, and his voice, usually a low rumble, was now a dangerous, icy baritone. He wasn't shouting, but the sheer force of his controlled fury vibrated through the air. He was speaking to someone, clearly a business rival, dismantling their arguments, their defenses, piece by calculated piece. She heard the other voice on the speakerphone, initially blustering, then faltering, then collapsing into desperate pleas. Victor's responses were brief, cutting, devoid of mercy. He was talking about contracts, about market shares, about personal consequences. It was a masterclass in ruthless power, a chilling display of how he crushed opposition without ever raising his voice above a deadly calm. He ended the call, the click of the phone echoing in the sudden silence. Maya felt a shiver run down her spine. He was not soft. He was utterly, terrifyingly ruthless. Her ex-fiancé and his family, she realized with a cold certainty, were truly out of their depth. They were children playing with fire, unaware of the inferno they were provoking. Victor emerged from his study moments later, his expression unreadable, as if he had merely been discussing the weather. He glanced at her, his eyes briefly meeting hers, and in that fleeting moment she saw not judgment, but a recognition of her understanding. His unwavering strength, his absolute control, was a shield, a force field. She understood then that his ruthlessness, his dominance, was precisely what made her safe. It wasn't about love, not yet, but it was about an unquestionable commitment to her protection. A profound sense of peace settled over her. She didn't need to question his methods, didn't need to fight his decisions. She just needed to trust. And as she looked at him, so impossibly large and powerful, she found herself yielding, implicitly accepting his guidance. In his formidable presence, in the fortress he had built around her, she found sanctuary. He was her protector, her wall against the world, and she was, willingly, completely under his absolute care. The calm Maya had found in Victor's formidable presence was a fragile thing, and it was tested almost immediately. Her ex-fiancé, Julian, fueled by a potent cocktail of shame and anger, wasn't content to simply disappear. He began his counterattack, not with open confrontation, but with insidious whispers and digital poison. Maya first noticed it in the subtle shift of her social media feeds, usually curated for quiet professionalism. Suddenly, there were anonymous accounts spreading thinly veiled gossip, resurrecting old innocuous photos from her past and twisting their context, hinting at a manipulative nature, a calculated climb. Then came the articles, not outright slander, but insidiously crafted pieces in lesser-known online publications, questioning her motives, her sudden engagement, painting her as a gold digger. Each online jab felt like a physical blow. The old anxieties, the deep-seated fear of public judgment that had shadowed her modest upbringing, resurfaced with chilling clarity. She saw the comments, the speculation, the cruel judgments from strangers who knew nothing of her pain. Her carefully constructed peace began to crack, and a cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. Even in the opulent sanctuary of Victor's penthouse, she felt exposed, vulnerable to the unseen barbs thrown from the shadows. She wanted to lash out, to defend herself, but she knew it would only fuel the fire. She felt a familiar helplessness, the heavy weight of being utterly alone against a tide of public opinion. Victor, however, was a fortress against such trivialities. He didn't need her to bring him the articles, didn't need her to explain her distress. He simply knew. His icy eyes would sweep over her, lingering for a fraction of a second when he noticed her quiet tension, the way her hand might unconsciously clench a napkin. He never asked if she was bothered, never offered gentle words of comfort. His response was far more absolute, more terrifyingly efficient. The online articles began to vanish, not just quietly taken down, but utterly erased from the internet, as if they had never existed. The anonymous social media accounts that had sprung up to disparage her suddenly went silent, their content scrubbed clean. It was as if an invisible hand, immense and powerful, had simply swept away the dust. The speed and thoroughness of it left Maya breathless. She knew with a certainty that chilled her that this was Victor's work. He didn't fight, he simply commanded the landscape, and any perceived threats to her or to his image of her were simply removed. But his retaliation didn't stop there. It extended beyond the digital realm, reaching into the very core of Julian's world. Maya began to see subtle yet devastating shifts in the news. A crucial deal for Julian's family's shipping company, a venture they had publicly lauded, inexplicably fell through. Then came a series of minor yet embarrassing public relations mishaps for Thorne Enterprises, each one causing a quiet ripple of financial strain and public scrutiny. A prominent investor suddenly pulled out of a joint project with Julian's uncle, citing unforeseen complications. It was a systematic dismantling, precise and calculated, executed with an almost surgical coldness. She watched it unfold, mesmerized and slightly terrified. There was no direct violence, no shouting matches, just the quiet, inexorable application of Victor's vast power. He would sometimes be on the phone in his study, his voice a low, steady rumble, completely devoid of emotion, and Maya would later see the consequence of that call play out in the financial pages. He wasn't just quashing rumors, he was strategically crippling Julian's family, making them pay a tangible price for their nephew's betrayal and their attempts to undermine her. Maya felt a complex mix of fear and an almost intoxicating sense of relief. His methods were ruthless, certainly. He was capable of devastating destruction without a single raised voice. But every time a fresh online attack disappeared, every time she read about a new blow to Julian's family, she felt an undeniable surge of security. This was his protection, dark and unyielding. It wasn't gentle, but it was absolute. No one would ever dare to publicly shame her again, not when Viktor Volkov stood as her shield. The initial unease she had felt at his ruthlessness began to recede, replaced by a profound, unwavering trust. She had traded the fragile peace of her old life for a fierce, unshakable sanctuary. She was under his protection, bound by his will, and in that binding, she found a safety more profound than she had ever known. His methods, harsh and unforgiving as they were undeniably effective. She felt undeniably safe, sheltered from a world that had sought to crush her, and she knew with a deep, quiet certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. The quiet victory Maya had felt after Victor effortlessly dismantled Julian's online attacks was short-lived. She had barely begun to adjust to the new, unsettling peace when a different kind of threat began to stir, one far more shadowy and menacing. It wasn't the petty squabbles of a jilted ex. This felt like something colder, more dangerous, a direct challenge to Victor himself, using her as the vulnerable point. Victor's world, she was learning, had deeper, darker currents than she could have imagined, and she, by marrying him, had been pulled into their treacherous flow. It started subtly. A car that seemed to follow hers a little too closely on a shopping trip, disappearing before her security detail could get a clear read. A strange, almost imperceptible shift in the expressions of the staff at a restaurant. A flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Maya, with her event planner's eye for detail, noticed these things, and a cold apprehension began to coil in her stomach. She was a target, a soft spot in Victor's impenetrable armor, and his enemies were beginning to test the edges of his formidable protection. One crisp London afternoon, as she was preparing to leave the penthouse for a charity luncheon, one of Victor's security team, a man named Sergei, a silent, imposing figure, stopped her. His face, usually a mask of stoicism, held a barely perceptible tension. "Mrs. Volkov," he said, his voice a low rumble, "there was a minor complication with the car." Maya's heart leapt. Complication? What happened? Sergei didn't elaborate, merely gestured for her to wait. A few minutes later, Victor himself entered the garage. His presence immediately filled the vast space, pushing back the lingering unease. He walked directly to her waiting vehicle, his gaze sharp and analytical. He wasn't angry, not precisely, but his icy calm held a dangerous edge. He gestured to the underside of the car, where a small, almost invisible device had been attached. It was sleek, black, and utterly chilling in its implication. A tracking device. Someone wanted to know where she was, to plot her movements, to find a weakness. The sight of it sent a shiver of fear straight through Maya. It was a tangible piece of the unseen enemy, a cold, metallic whisper of malice. She felt a profound violation, a sudden, stark realization of the danger that now clung to her because of Victor. Her hands trembled, her carefully composed facade threatening to crack. She was no longer just dealing with a scorned ex. She was a pawn in a game played by titans, a game where the stakes were terrifyingly high. Victor, observing her reaction, simply reached down and, with a swift, almost contemptuous movement, ripped the device free. It snapped in his hand, a small, insignificant piece of plastic rendered useless. His eyes, cold and unwavering, met hers. "They are probing," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion, "but they will find nothing." He didn't offer comfort, but a statement of absolute fact, a promise of impenetrable protection. Immediately the security around Maya visibly tightened. Her personal detail, already a constant presence, became even more vigilant. The men were shadows, always there, yet never quite seen, their eyes constantly scanning, assessing. She felt the weight of their gaze, the constant awareness of unseen threats, the tension in the air around her, but with it came an overwhelming sense of being shielded, of being utterly safe within their protective circle. Victor was a master of his domain, and his domain now included her. Later that evening, Victor sat across from her in his study, the city lights a glittering backdrop. He didn't ask her opinion, didn't seek her consent. He simply informed her, his voice a low, unyielding command. "Your public appearances will be more tightly controlled. All movements restricted to approved locations. No deviations." Maya listened, her heart quickening, but not with protest. She understood. This wasn't about punishment, it was about survival, about her survival. He was building higher walls, fortifying the fortress around her, not for his convenience, but for her absolute safety. She looked at his formidable profile, the unshakable certainty in his eyes, and knew, deep in her gut, that he saw threats she couldn't even comprehend. He wasn't asking. He was stating, he was protecting. "I understand," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was not a reluctant acceptance, but a full, willing surrender. She trusted his judgment implicitly. He had shown her again and again that his capacity to protect her was absolute. He might be terrifying, his world might be dark and dangerous, but in his unyielding control she found an undeniable sanctuary. He was her impenetrable shield, and she yielded to his will, fully, completely, knowing that under his command she was unassailable. She was safe. The quiet victory Maya had felt after Victor effortlessly dismantled Julian's online attacks was short-lived. She had barely begun to adjust to the new, unsettling peace when a different kind of threat began to stir, one far more shadowy and menacing. It wasn't the petty squabbles of a jilted ex. This felt like something colder, more dangerous, a direct challenge to Victor himself, using her as the vulnerable point. Victor's world, she was learning, had deeper, darker currents than she could have imagined, and she, by marrying him, had been pulled into their treacherous flow. It started subtly. A car that seemed to follow hers a little too closely on a shopping trip, disappearing before her security detail could get a clear read. A strange, almost imperceptible shift in the expressions of the staff at a restaurant, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Maya, with her event planner's eye for detail, noticed these things, and a cold apprehension began to coil in her stomach. She was a target, a soft spot in Victor's impenetrable armor, and his enemies were beginning to test the edges of his formidable protection. One crisp London afternoon, as she was preparing to leave the penthouse for a charity luncheon, one of Victor's security team, a man named Sergei, a silent, imposing figure, stopped her. His face, usually a mask of stoicism, held a barely perceptible tension. "Mrs. Volkov," he said, his voice a low rumble, "there was a minor complication with the car." Maya's heart leaped. Complication? What happened? Sergei didn't elaborate, merely gestured for her to wait. A few minutes later, Victor himself entered the garage. His presence immediately filled the vast space, pushing back the lingering unease. He walked directly to her waiting vehicle, his gaze sharp and analytical. He wasn't angry, not precisely, but his icy calm held a dangerous edge. He gestured to the underside of the car, where a small, almost invisible device had been attached. It was sleek, black, and utterly chilling in its implication. A tracking device. Someone wanted to know where she was, to plot her movements, to find a weakness. The sight of it sent a shiver of fear straight through Maya. It was a tangible piece of the unseen enemy, a cold, metallic whisper of malice. She felt a profound violation, a sudden, stark realization of the danger that now clung to her because of Victor. Her hands trembled, her carefully composed facade threatening to crack. She was no longer just dealing with a scorned ex. She was a pawn in a game played by titans, a game where the stakes were terrifyingly high. Victor, observing her reaction, simply reached down and, with a swift, almost contemptuous movement, ripped the device free. It snapped in his hand, a small, insignificant piece of plastic rendered useless. His eyes, cold and unwavering, met hers. "They are probing," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion, "but they will find nothing." He didn't offer comfort, but a statement of absolute fact, a promise of impenetrable protection. Immediately, the security around Maya visibly tightened. Her personal detail, already a constant presence, became even more vigilant. The men were shadows, always there, yet never quite seen, their eyes constantly scanning, assessing. She felt the weight of their gaze, the constant awareness of unseen threats, the tension in the air around her. But with it came an overwhelming sense of being shielded, of being utterly safe within their protective circle. Victor was a master of his domain, and his domain now included her. Later that evening, Victor sat across from her in his study, the city lights a glittering backdrop. He didn't ask her opinion, didn't seek her consent. He simply informed her, his voice a low, unyielding command. "Your public appearances will be more tightly controlled. All movements restricted to approved locations. No deviations." Maya listened, her heart quickening, but not with protest. She understood. This wasn't about punishment. It was about survival, about her survival. He was building higher walls, fortifying the fortress around her, not for his convenience, but for her absolute safety. She looked at his formidable profile, the unshakable certainty in his eyes, and knew, deep in her gut, that he saw threats she couldn't even comprehend. He wasn't asking, he was stating, he was protecting. "I understand," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was not a reluctant acceptance, but a full, willing surrender. She trusted his judgment implicitly. He had shown her, again and again, that his capacity to protect her was absolute. He might be terrifying, His world might be dark and dangerous, but in his unyielding control, she found an undeniable sanctuary. He was her impenetrable shield, and she yielded to his will, fully, completely, knowing that under his command, she was unassailable. She was safe. The next morning, the direct, personal attack came. Her old friend, Chloe, a bubbly, kind-hearted woman who ran a small florist shop called Maya, in a state of barely suppressed panic. Chloe's voice was trembling, recounting a visit from two impeccably dressed but chillingly silent men. They hadn't threatened her overtly, but their questions about Maya, their pointed remarks about the fragility of small businesses, and a subtle implication about choosing sides had left Chloe utterly terrified. "Maya," Chloe had whispered, "I think you need to be careful. They know about me. They know about us." A cold dread seeped into Maya's bones. This wasn't just about her, it was about those she cared for, those connected to her past. It was a calculated move, aiming to isolate her, to show Victor that his enemies could reach beyond his immediate sphere of influence. A wave of guilt washed over her, a desperate need to protect Chloe, to undo the danger her new life had brought. The fortress Victor had built around her felt less like a sanctuary and more like a magnet for destruction, pulling innocent people into its orbit. She felt the surge of helplessness, the familiar inability to defend herself or others against such insidious threats. She didn't need to seek Victor out. He was already there, standing in the doorway of the living room, his presence a silent answer to her distress. He hadn't heard the call, but his icy gaze, sharp and perceptive, had seen her anguish, the tremble in her hands as she ended the conversation. He didn't ask what was wrong. Instead, he simply walked over, his steps deliberate, and settled into the chair opposite her. His voice was low, cutting through her frantic thoughts like a surgeon's scalpel. "Chloe Davies, owner of Petal and Bloom on Portobello Road," he stated, a flat, undeniable fact. "Two men, employees of a rival firm, attempting to leverage information regarding my personal arrangements. They tried to intimidate her to gather intelligence on your habits, your vulnerabilities, perhaps even to relay a message to you." Maya stared, speechless. He knew. He always knew. He hadn't just known about the tracking device on her car. He knew about Chloe, about the men, about their employer. He'd been aware, anticipating, always one step ahead. Her mind reeled at the sheer depth of his intelligence network, the unseen eyes and ears that permeated every corner of London. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "They are already dealt with. Chloe will not be bothered again, nor will anyone else connected to you." His words were not a promise, but a decree, absolute and unyielding. Julian's family, in their desperation, are making alliances with those who vastly outrank them in ambition and ruthlessness. They are children playing with fire, unaware of the inferno they are provoking by involving you. Maya felt a profound shift within her. The panic began to recede, replaced by a chilling clarity. Her ex-fiancé, his powerful family, all their machinations and petty revenges, they were insignificant. They were mere pawns, blindly stirring up forces they couldn't possibly comprehend, forces that Victor alone could control. The scale of Victor's power, his reach, his ability to neutralize threats before they even fully materialized, was utterly overwhelming. He didn't just react. He predicted, he orchestrated, he dominated. He saw the realization dawn in her eyes, the last vestiges of her independent fear giving way to a profound, almost reverent awe. He didn't ask if she was afraid. He simply stated, his voice a low, steady rumble that resonated deep within her, "You are safe. Always." It was not a question, not a gentle reassurance. It was a statement of absolute fact. A binding promise from a man whose word was law. Her vulnerability, the lingering fear that had plagued her, solidified into an unshakable faith in his strength. In that moment, Maya understood that her only true safety lay in her complete trust, her absolute submission to his protection. He was her wall against the world, her impenetrable shield, and under his formidable, unyielding care, she was utterly, unequivocally safe. The pristine order of Victor's study was a stark contrast to the storm brewing within Maya. She had been sent to retrieve a specific financial report for him, a thick binder from a locked drawer. He had given her the key, a rare sign of trust in his meticulously controlled world. As she reached for the binder, her fingers brushed against a thin, black leather folder tucked beneath it, partially obscured. Curiosity, a dangerous instinct she usually suppressed, pricked at her. Victor was not a man who left things to chance or to accident. A whisper in her mind suggested this was no accident at all. Perhaps, she thought, he intended for her to find it. Her heart thumped against her ribs as she pulled out the folder. Inside, nestled among other official-looking documents, were photographs. Not just any photographs. These were candid, discreetly taken shots of Julian. Julian at a dimly lit bar, his arm around a woman who was definitely not Maya. Julian laughing, his head tilted back, intimately close to the same woman. Julian, weeks before their wedding, outside a quiet restaurant, kissing her goodbye. And then, a final sickening image, Julian in a hotel corridor, the very same corridor where Maya had found him, looking furtively around before slipping into a room with the same woman. The timestamp on that last photo was a week before Maya's wedding day. The air left Maya's lungs in a painful gasp. It wasn't just a recent betrayal, it was a prolonged, calculated deception, and Victor had known. He had possessed this undeniable evidence for weeks, perhaps even months, yet he had allowed her to walk into that hotel, to prepare for a wedding that was already a lie. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just saved her from the rain, he had orchestrated her dramatic fall, setting the stage for her humiliation, knowing exactly when and how she would shatter, just as the hot sting of betrayal, sharp and unexpected, threatened to overwhelm her. Victor's voice cut through the silence, as if he had sensed her discovery from across the vast apartment. "You found it." Maya whirled around, clutching the folder to her chest. He stood in the doorway, a towering, unreadable silhouette against the light, his gaze fixed on her. There was no apology in his eyes, no regret, only a cold, unwavering expectation. He had known, and he had allowed her to find out this way. It was a deliberate unveiling, a calculated move. "You knew," she whispered, the words catching in her throat, raw with a mix of shock and a strange, unfamiliar fear. "You knew about Julian weeks ago." He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement that confirmed her worst suspicion. Julian Thorne was a means to an end for his family, and a weakness for my rival, his uncle. I had been watching him for months. His infidelity was not a secret to me. His voice was calm, devoid of emotion, as if discussing a business transaction. "I ensured you would discover it at the precise moment it would cause the most public damage to his reputation, and by extension, his family's interests." Maya felt a fresh wave of humiliation, then a surge of anger. He had played her, used her pain as a weapon in his own silent war. She had been a pawn, a carefully positioned piece in his ruthless game. The carefully constructed piece she had found in his protection threatened to crumble. She felt manipulated, exposed in a way that Julian's betrayal had never quite managed. But then, as Victor's icy gaze held hers, something shifted. She looked at the photographs again, the undeniable proof of Julian's long-standing deceit, the casual cruelty of his actions. She remembered the quiet compromise of her life before, the subtle ways Julian had made her feel inadequate, ashamed of her modest background. She remembered the desperate longing to be chosen, to be proudly acknowledged. Victor hadn't just exposed Julian, he had liberated her. He had ripped her from a life of quiet, emotional neglect, from a man who was incapable of truly choosing her, from a future that would have been a gilded cage of polite indifference. He had offered her not just revenge, but an escape route she hadn't even realized she desperately needed. His methods were brutal, his manipulation undeniable, but his outcome was salvation. He stepped closer, his presence looming, making her feel impossibly small, yet undeniably safe within his orbit. You were blind to his true nature, Maya. He would have eventually broken you, slowly, quietly, away from public view. I simply expedited the inevitable and ensured he paid a price for his weakness. His eyes, usually so cold, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. A possessive satisfaction, perhaps, or a dark, unyielding concern for his possession. Her initial resentment dissolved, replaced by a profound, almost dizzying awe for his foresight, his absolute control over every variable. He had seen the truth, long before she ever could, and he had acted. He hadn't rescued her gently, he had violently uprooted her, tearing her from a poisonous garden to transplant her into his formidable fortress. And in that moment she realized, with a clarity that resonated deep within her soul, that she was grateful, deeply, terrifyingly grateful. She looked at him, her eyes wide, and slowly, deliberately, lowered the folder, letting the damning photographs fall back onto the desk. She didn't need them as proof. She had him, and in his terrifying, absolute control, she found not just safety, but a strange, fierce pride. He had chosen her, undeniably, ruthlessly, making her his. Her small, quiet life was over. Her new life, under his absolute protection, was just beginning, forged in the fires of his dark, unyielding vision. Her submission to his will, to his way of seeing and controlling the world, deepened, becoming not a reluctant acquiescence, but a willing, powerful devotion. She was his, entirely. The revelation of Victor's calculated manipulation, his foresight in orchestrating Julian's public downfall, had left Maya in a strange, disorienting state. The initial sting of feeling like a pawn had given way to a profound awe, a terrifying gratitude for his ruthless, absolute control. She had been saved, violently perhaps, but undeniably saved from a life of quiet despair. She was still processing the sheer scale of his power, the chilling efficiency with which he bent the world to his will, when her phone, usually a quiet presence, chimed with an incoming call. It was her mother. A flicker of hope ignited in Maya's chest, a desperate longing for solace, for a mother's comforting voice after all the emotional turmoil. But the moment she answered, that hope was extinguished, replaced by a cold, familiar disappointment. Her mother's voice, usually so concerned with appearances, was now tinged with an unfamiliar urgency, a thinly veiled desperation. "Maya, darling, are you really all right? This whole situation with Viktor Volkov, it's quite a scandal, isn't it?" Her words were a preamble, not a genuine inquiry. Julian's family, they're devastated, and they're willing to make amends. A substantial sum, darling, for you, of course, if you were to discreetly annul this marriage. Go somewhere quiet, start fresh. With Julian, perhaps, after a respectable interval. The words hit Maya like a physical blow. Hush money. A payment for her to disappear, to erase her from Victor's side and return to the man who had publicly shamed her. Her mother wasn't offering comfort. She was brokering a deal, trading her daughter's dignity for a payout. The betrayal was deeper, more insidious than Julian's infidelity. Julian had broken her heart, but her mother was trying to sell her soul. A wave of nausea washed over Maya. She clutched the phone, her knuckles white. "Mother, How could you even suggest such a thing?" Her voice was barely a whisper, thick with disbelief and a fresh, agonizing heartbreak. "He cheated on me. You saw what he did. But, darling, the Thorne family name, the connections. Viktor Volkov is dangerous. This isn't a life for you. They're offering a fresh start, a clean slate. Think of the stability, the quiet life you always wanted." Her mother's voice pleaded, not for Maya's happiness, but for a financial security that now seemed utterly grotesque. Maya hung up, the silence that followed more deafening than any shout. The phone slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering softly on the polished floor. Utterly alone. That was the crushing truth. Her mother's mercenary betrayal left her feeling more isolated than ever before. Julian had chosen another woman, but her own mother had chosen money over her daughter's well-being, over her daughter's pain. It was a stark, brutal contrast to Viktor's harsh but unwavering loyalty. He might have used her, manipulated her, but he had never once considered abandoning her. He fought for her, even if it was for his own dark motives. A shadow fell over her. Viktor stood in the doorway, his immense frame filling the space. He hadn't been in the room, but his eyes, cold and piercing, held a knowing glint. He had heard enough, or perhaps his network had already informed him. There was no need for explanations. "Your mother," he stated, his voice a low, dangerous growl that sent a shiver down her spine. "It was not a question. She seeks to profit from your current arrangements." Maya could only nod, tears blurring her vision. She felt exposed, ashamed of her mother's weakness. Viktor stepped closer, his presence a powerful, unyielding force. He reached down and picked up the phone, his fingers closing around it with an almost crushing grip. "She called to beg you to return to a man who dishonored you for a sum of money." "Yes," Maya choked out, the humiliation burning in her cheeks. His eyes narrowed, a glacial fury hardening his expression. "Human weakness is predictable," he murmured, his voice laced with a chilling disdain. He didn't offer a word of comfort for her pain, but his anger, sharp and cold, was directed at her mother's treachery, a testament to his strange, fierce possessiveness of Maya. "You will have no further contact with her, ever." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command, absolute and non-negotiable. His words, though harsh, were a protective barrier, cutting off the source of her renewed pain and vulnerability. He was tightening his protective circle even further, severing her last link to a past that sought to undermine her, to compromise her safety. Maya looked at him, at his formidable, unyielding strength, and in that moment she clung to it. Her mother's plea, once a source of confusion, now felt like a very real threat to her safety, to the sanctuary she had found with Viktor. Her mother wanted her to leave him, to step out from under his impenetrable shield and expose herself once more to the world's cruelties, to Julian's continued deceit. No, she would not. She didn't want that fragile, conditional freedom. She wanted this absolute, terrifying protection. Utterly alone in the world save for Viktor, she leaned into his strength, found her anchor in his command. He was her only constant, her only protector. He was her entire world now, and she was completely, absolutely his. The hushed elegance of the gallery opening felt like a thin veneer over a simmering pot of tension. Maya, dressed in a simple yet exquisite black dress, moved through the art-filled room, a glass of untouched champagne in her hand. Viktor had stepped away for a moment, drawn into a conversation with a prominent minister, and for the first time in weeks, Maya felt a subtle shift in her protective bubble. The ever-present security detail was still there, of course, their gazes sweeping the room, but without Viktor's towering presence directly beside her, she felt a sliver of exposure, a quiet vulnerability. She knew Julian would be here. His family, desperate to regain some semblance of their former standing, had made sure he was invited to every event, a pathetic attempt to show they weren't completely ruined. Maya had seen him from across the room earlier, his face pale and drawn, his eyes burning with a resentment that made her skin prickle. She had tried to avoid his gaze, clinging to the calm Victor instilled in her, but now, alone for a moment, she felt the familiar knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Then, a voice, laced with bitter sarcasm, sliced through the genteel chatter. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in, or should I say, the monster claimed." Maya froze. Julian. He stood before her, flanked by two men she vaguely recognized as his cousins, both looking uncomfortable but defiant. Julian's eyes, once familiar, were now cold and venomous. He had clearly been drinking, his breath acrid with alcohol, emboldened by desperation, and perhaps a twisted sense of entitlement. "Still playing the trophy, Maya?" he sneered, stepping closer, invading her personal space. "Did he buy you that dress, or are you just a particularly expensive accessory now?" Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She wanted to retreat, to disappear, but she couldn't. Her training, Victor's unspoken rules, screamed at her to maintain composure, to project an image of unshakable poise. But her body trembled, a primal fear seizing her. "You have no right to speak to me," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. Julian laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Right. I had every right, Maya. You were mine. You belonged to me." He lunged forward, his hand shooting out not to strike but to grab her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh with surprising force. "Come on, let's go. This isn't where you belong. You belong with me. You always did." A cry caught in her throat. The violation of his touch, the sheer audacity of his claim, sent a fresh wave of terror through her. She tried to pull away, but his grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by a raw, desperate anger. She felt completely exposed, utterly helpless. The gallery's elegant crowd, suddenly a sea of indifferent faces. Then, a ripple. Not a sound, but a palpable shift in the air, a sudden sharp drop in temperature. Julian's grip faltered, his eyes widening in sudden, stark terror as he looked past Maya. Victor. He stood perhaps 10 feet away, a dark, immovable force, his presence radiating an intensity that silenced the entire room. His eyes, usually icy, were now molten obsidian, burning with a rage so profound it stole the air from Maya's lungs. It wasn't a loud, chaotic anger. It was a cold, terrifying fury, controlled and lethal. He hadn't uttered a word, but the message was clear, vibrating through every nerve ending in Maya's body. Touch her and die. Julian, his face draining of all color, released her arm as if burned. He stumbled back, stammering apologies that died in his throat. Victor didn't move towards him directly. Instead, his gaze swept over the room, settling for a terrifying moment on Julian's cousins, then on a man in a discreet corner who was clearly Julian's uncle, the family patriarch. Victor raised a single imperious hand, making a slight, almost imperceptible gesture to one of his own security men. The effect was immediate and devastating. Within seconds, a hush fell over the room. Phones began to vibrate, discreetly at first, then more urgently. Whispers erupted, not about Maya or Julian, but about panicked financial news. Maya saw Julian's uncle's face turn ashen, his eyes darting to his phone, then to Victor, a dawning horror in his expression. One of Julian's cousins let out a choked sound, his phone clattering to the floor. It was a simultaneous public unraveling. Victor hadn't laid a hand on Julian, but he had just, with a single gesture, triggered a cascade of financial ruin. The message was delivered with brutal clarity. This is what happens when you touch what is mine. Shaken, her arm still tingling from Julian's grasp, Maya felt a wave of dizzying relief. The fear still trembled within her, but it was quickly overshadowed by an overwhelming sense of safety, a profound, primal understanding of Victor's protection. He was a terrifying force, a destructive power, but he was her destructive power. He had destroyed Julian without a single physical blow, simply by unleashing his will. Victor finally moved, his steps deliberate, closing the distance between them. He didn't look at Julian, who stood frozen, utterly humiliated and broken. Victor's hand came up, not to touch her face, but to gently, almost imperceptibly, brush his thumb over the spot on her arm, where Julian had grabbed her. It was a possessive, silent acknowledgement of the violation, and a promise of ultimate retribution. Maya felt her knees tremble, but her gaze was fixed on his. In his eyes, she saw not just fury, but an unshakable resolve. She was his, and he would burn the world to keep her safe. The last vestiges of her independent will dissolved. She didn't want to be strong alone. She wanted to be strong with him under his command, protected by his formidable power. Without thinking, without a single conscious decision, she leaned into his side, seeking the solid, immovable wall of his body. His arm came around her, a firm, possessive embrace that sealed her against him, shielding her from the stunned gazes of the room, from the wreckage of Julian's life, from any lingering threat. In his embrace, surrounded by the quiet devastation he had wrought, Maya finally understood. Her role was simple: to be his, cherished and protected. And for the first time, she accepted it not as a burden, but as an absolute, undeniable sanctuary. The aftermath of the gallery incident left Maya profoundly shaken, yet strangely exhilarated. The sheer, terrifying power Victor had wielded, the silent devastation he had unleashed with a mere gesture, had solidified her understanding of her place by his side. Julian was no longer a threat, merely a broken, pathetic figure. His family, once formidable, was now crumbling under Victor's calculated pressure. The world had shifted irrevocably, and she was at the epicenter, protected by the most dangerous man she had ever known. A few days later, Victor summoned her to his study. The air in the room felt charged, heavy with an unspoken tension. He stood by the panoramic window overlooking the Thames, his back to her, an imposing silhouette against the city lights. When he turned, his gaze, usually cold and assessing, held a different quality now, a deep, unyielding possessiveness that made her breath catch. "The Riverside Charity Gala is in 2 weeks, he stated, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very floor. "It is not merely an event, Maya. It is a trap, a final stage for the play we have been enacting." Maya's heart quickened. A trap. The word was chilling, yet it resonated with a strange, dark excitement. She listened, her attention completely captured, every nerve ending alert. She instinctively knew this was not a conversation, but a revelation, a strategic briefing from a general to his most trusted, most vital lieutenant. He walked over to his large, polished desk, spreading out a series of detailed floor plans and security schematics. Julian's uncle, in his desperation, believes he has found a way to reclaim his lost prestige, to humiliate me publicly. He will attempt to use Julian as a tool, to disrupt the gala, perhaps even to create a scene that will discredit us both. Victor's lips thinned, a flash of pure, cold contempt in his eyes. "He misunderstands my nature. This gala is not a weakness. It is an invitation for them to step into the noose." He looked at her then, his gaze piercing, demanding her absolute comprehension. "I intend to use this event to finally and decisively eliminate Julian, his family, and any associated threats to my empire. They will be exposed, destroyed, and their ruin will be complete. You, Maya, will be the glittering centerpiece of this victory." The words settled over her, chilling and exhilarating. She was to be the bait, the radiant, untouchable symbol of his power, drawing his enemies into their final downfall. A flicker of fear, a natural human instinct tried to surface, but it was quickly subsumed by a fierce surge of loyalty, a profound sense of purpose. This was her revenge, too, delivered with the cold, precise hand of Viktor Volkov. "Your role," he continued, his voice softer now, but no less commanding, "is to be my unwavering partner. To stand by my side, poised and impenetrable. You are a public symbol of my power, my absolute ownership. You are my emotional anchor, my quiet strength amidst the impending chaos. You will follow my every lead, respond to my every glance. There will be no hesitation, no doubt." He wasn't asking if she was capable. He was stating her purpose, her vital, non-negotiable role. Maya felt a thrill run through her, a powerful sense of being utterly chosen, utterly essential to his grand design. Her past self, the girl who kept the peace, who faded into the background, was gone. This woman, Mrs. Volkov, was being forged in fire, her strength drawn from his unyielding will. She was to be his reflection, his extension, his most prized possession. He then outlined the security protocols with meticulous detail. Every entrance, every exit, every potential point of confrontation was covered. He spoke of countermeasures, of surveillance, of the precise timing of events. There was no asking for her permission to be put in such a position, no gentle explanation of the risks. There was only the calm, absolute statement of his intentions, and her vital, unquestioning role within them. He expected her full trust, her complete obedience, and she realized with a profound sense of clarity that she was more than willing to give it. "You will choose a gown fitting for the occasion," he concluded, his gaze sweeping over her, a silent appreciation in his eyes. "Something that announces your triumph and my claim." Maya felt a fierce determination bloom within her. Fear was a distant echo. She would not only stand by his side, she would embody his power, his will. She would be magnificent. She would be his. She trusted him completely, implicitly, to navigate this storm, to protect her, to destroy anyone who dared to challenge their bond. In his formidable hands, surrounded by his absolute command, she knew she was utterly safe, cherished, and finally truly home. She would wear the thick black wedding band like a crown, a symbol of her willing submission and her undeniable place by his side. She was ready. The Riverside Charity Gala was a glittering tableau, a symphony of hushed conversations, clinking crystal, and the soft murmur of London's elite. The grand hall, draped in silk and bathed in the warm glow of chandeliers, overlooked the dark, shimmering expanse of the Thames. Maya stood by Victor's side, a vision in a bespoke gown of emerald green, its fabric clinging to her curves with quiet confidence. Every eye in the room seemed to gravitate towards them, drawn by the undeniable magnetism of Viktor Volkov, and by the woman who now stood as his undisputed claim. She felt the weight of their gazes, the curious whispers, the barely concealed envy, but in Victor's formidable presence she felt unassailable. Her thick black wedding band, a solid, unyielding promise, gleamed on her finger, a visible marker of her new, powerful status. Yet beneath the glittering facade, Maya sensed a deep, unsettling tension, like a wire pulled taut. The air was thick with it, an almost palpable hum of anticipation. She noticed the small details. More than a few champagne glasses around them remained untouched, their bubbles slowly dissipating, a silent testament to the charged atmosphere. Her training as an event planner, her years of observing human behavior, made her acutely aware of every shift, every subtle movement. Her gaze, ever perceptive, drifted across the opulent room, and there they were, Julian, her ex-fiancé, and his uncle, the powerful patriarch whose empire Victor was systematically dismantling. They stood near a velvet rope, their faces pale with fury, eyes burning with a desperate, impotent rage. Julian's jaw was clenched, his shoulders rigid, a vein throbbing visibly in his temple. His uncle, usually so composed, looked haggard, a shadow of his former imperious self. They watched Maya and Victor with a raw intensity that made her skin prickle. The atmosphere, already electric, seemed to hum louder, a silent countdown to the inevitable. Suddenly a disturbance. A ripple of unease spread through the impeccably dressed crowd as Julian detached himself from his uncle, his movements jerky, uncoordinated. He wasn't alone. Two burly, unfamiliar men, clearly hired thugs, followed a few steps behind him, their presence jarringly out of place in the elegant setting. Julian's eyes were fixed on Maya, a wild, almost deranged light in their depths, fueled by desperation and, she suspected, a significant amount of alcohol. "Maya!" His voice, raw and slurred, cut through the genteel chatter, instantly silencing the room. Every head snapped towards him, then to her. The blood drained from Maya's face, a cold dread seizing her. This was it, the confrontation Victor had warned her about. Julian stormed towards her, ignoring the stunned faces, ignoring the subtle attempts by Victor's security to intercept him. He pushed through a small cluster of guests, his face contorted with a grotesque mix of anger and self-pity. You traitor!" he spat, pointing a trembling finger at her. "Standing there like you belong with me." He reached them, his breath acrid, his eyes wild. He didn't hesitate, didn't pause for a moment of doubt. His hand shot out not to strike, but to seize her arm, his fingers digging into her skin with surprising force. "Come on, Maya, you're coming with me. This isn't you. This isn't where you belong." He tugged, trying to drag her away from Victor's side, away from the impenetrable wall that was her husband. The sheer audacity of his touch, the public violation of his claim, sent a shockwave through Maya. Her breath hitched, a silent cry trapped in her throat. She felt exposed, vulnerable, the old shame threatening to consume her once more. Her carefully constructed composure threatened to shatter, her mind screaming for escape, for protection. She knew Julian sought not just to take her, but to undermine Victor, to publicly challenge his authority, to prove that his terrifying grip was not absolute. And for a terrifying second, as she felt the brutal pull on her arm, she feared Victor's control might indeed be broken. Her eyes, wide with a desperate plea, darted to Victor's face, seeking the strength she knew she needed, the absolute protection she had come to rely on. She was his entirely, and now he needed to claim her. The brutal pull on Maya's arm, Julian's raw, hateful grip, was a physical violation that ripped through her carefully constructed calm. Her breath hitched, a silent scream trapped in her throat. She felt utterly exposed, the old shame threatening to consume her, her mind screaming for escape, for protection. She knew Julian sought not just to take her, but to undermine Victor, to publicly challenge his authority, to prove that his terrifying grip was not absolute. And for a terrifying second, as she felt the brutal pull on her arm, she feared Victor's control might indeed be broken. Her eyes, wide with a desperate plea, darted to Victor's face, seeking the strength she knew she needed, the absolute protection she had come to rely on. She was his entirely, and now he needed to claim her. Victor's composure shattered. It wasn't a shout or a sudden roar of anger. It was something far more terrifying. The air around him seemed to thicken, to hum with a primal, lethal energy. His body, already immense, seemed to expand, radiating a silent, destructive force that silenced the room more effectively than any command. His eyes, fixed on Julian's hand on Maya's arm, were no longer icy. They were molten black pits of pure, unadulterated fury. Before Julian could even register the shift, before Maya could even fully comprehend what was happening, Victor moved. It was terrifyingly swift, a blur of controlled violence. One of Julian's hired thugs, a hulking man who had been attempting to block Victor's path, found himself suddenly seized. There was a sickening crack that echoed through the stunned hall, a sharp, wet sound that made Maya's stomach lurch. The man's arm twisted at an unnatural angle, his face contorting in a silent scream before he crumpled to the floor, clutching his broken limb. It was precise, brutal, and utterly devastating. Victor hadn't wasted a single movement, hadn't uttered a single word. He had simply eliminated an obstacle with terrifying efficiency. Then his full primal fury turned on Julian. The terrified light in Julian's eyes was already dawning, but it was too late. Victor reached for him, not with a gentle hand, but with the cold, absolute certainty of a predator seizing its prey. Julian, small and insignificant in Victor's grasp, was lifted effortlessly, his feet dangling uselessly as Victor dragged him across the polished marble floor. The decorative fountain, a centerpiece of the gala, shimmered invitingly. Victor didn't hesitate. With a guttural growl that reverberated through Maya's very bones, he plunged Julian's head into the water, holding him down with terrifying force. Maya watched, horrified, mesmerized. Julian thrashed, his struggles growing weaker, the elegant fountain now a scene of terrifying violence. Bubbles rose to the surface, then stopped. Victor's hand, large and unyielding, remained clamped on Julian's head, pushing him deeper, closer to the brink. The message was clear, brutal and permanent. The threat was being neutralized, irrevocably. Maya felt a shiver, a mix of terror and an intoxicating, dark satisfaction. No one, absolutely no one, would ever touch her again. Just as the silence in the room became unbearable, Victor's own men, efficient and silent, moved forward, not to stop him, but to pull him off Julian. It was a controlled intervention, a precise extraction. Victor released Julian, letting his limp form fall back into the shallow water with a splash. He gasped, sputtering, barely conscious, utterly broken. The cameras, hidden discreetly around the gala, began to flash, capturing the raw dominance, the terrifying display of power. The images, Maya knew, would define this night and every player involved. In the stunned, horrified silence that followed, whispers began to circulate, hushed and frantic. Annulment, offers of a safe life abroad for Maya, a way out of this dangerous world. Freedom. But Maya barely registered them. Her eyes, wide and unwavering, were fixed on Victor. He stood over Julian's shattered form, his chest heaving slightly, his eyes still burning with a dangerous, possessive fire. He turned then, his gaze sweeping over the wreckage, over the cowed guests, over the broken man in the fountain. Finally, his eyes, still searing with that molten fury, found hers. There was no question in his gaze of whether she was frightened or if she wanted to leave. It was a silent, challenging question of devotion, an unspoken demand for her absolute understanding and unwavering choice. He had destroyed for her. What would she do now? The chaos that had erupted at the gala, a maelstrom of shock and violence, was swiftly and decisively brought under Victor's absolute control. Maya watched, almost in a daze, as his men moved with chilling efficiency. Julian's broken form was discreetly removed, the hired thugs apprehended, and the stunned guests, though whispering frantically, were gently but firmly ushered out. The flashing cameras, which had captured the raw, brutal display, seemed to vanish, their images destined for Victor's impenetrable vaults, not the public eye. By the time the first streaks of dawn painted the London sky, the Grand Hall was immaculate once more, the incident swept clean, leaving only a lingering chill in the air, a silent testament to the night's terrifying events. The headlines, when they appeared a day later, were a testament to Victor's immense power. There was no mention of the brawl, no hint of the near drowning. Instead, they spoke of a minor disturbance, swiftly handled, of Viktor Volkov's continued philanthropic efforts, and of a brief, regrettable overreaction from a disgraced former associate. Julian's name and that of his family was now conspicuously absent from any reputable publication, their reputations and businesses not just damaged, but utterly dismantled, dissolved into the ether as if they had never existed. Maya felt a profound, chilling awe. Victor didn't just win, he erased. He destroyed, then made it as if the destruction had never happened, leaving only his triumph. Later that evening, in the quiet sanctuary of Victor's penthouse, he called her into his study. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the city lights, a stark contrast to the raw emotion that still thrummed beneath Maya's skin. He stood by the window, his back to her, an imposing silhouette that seemed to absorb all the light. When he turned, his face was unreadable, but his eyes, usually cold, held a deep, unyielding possessiveness that made her breath catch. "It is done," he stated, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "Julian Thorne and his family are no longer a factor. Their influence is gone. Their business is liquidated. They will trouble no one again, especially not you." Maya felt a shiver, a mix of fear and a strange, dark satisfaction. He had delivered on his promise, brutally and completely. Then he stepped away from the window, moving towards her with a slow, deliberate pace that commanded her full attention. His presence loomed, making her feel impossibly small, yet utterly centered by his gravity. "Now, Maya," he began, his voice softer but no less commanding, "the terms of our agreement have been met. The revenge is complete. You have upheld your end admirably." He paused, his gaze searching hers, cold and unwavering. "I offer you a choice, a quiet annulment, a safe life abroad, in any city you desire, financial security for as long as you wish, freedom from this world, from me, from the dangers that will always follow me." Her heart hammered against her ribs. Freedom, the word, once so alluring, now felt strangely hollow. She could walk away. She could have a life of quiet anonymity, far from the shadows and power games. It was everything she had once longed for, a chance to escape. But as she looked into his icy, possessive eyes, she knew this wasn't just an offer. It was a final test, a silent question of devotion. He was offering her an exit, but he was watching, waiting to see if she would truly take it. She remembered Julian, his casual cruelty, his easy betrayal. She remembered her mother, begging her to return to a life of compromise for money. She remembered the crushing weight of public shame, the desperate longing to be undeniably chosen. And then she looked at Victor, at the man who had seen her broken, exposed, and instead of pity, had offered her power. He had fought for her, destroying anyone who dared to threaten her peace, burning down a world that sought to hurt her. He had chosen her, ruthlessly, absolutely, making her his shield, his anchor, his most treasured possession. She didn't want safety from him. She wanted safety with him, a fierce resolve solidified within her, stronger than any fear, deeper than any desire for easy freedom. She took a breath, then took a single deliberate step towards him, then another, and another. She closed the small distance between them until she stood directly before him, her gaze meeting his without a flicker of doubt. "I am not leaving," she stated, her voice quiet but firm, imbued with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I am yours, Victor." A subtle shift, almost imperceptible, crossed his features, a flicker of something that might have been approval or perhaps a deep, possessive satisfaction. His hand, large and warm, came up to cup her jaw, his thumb brushing lightly over her cheekbone, and then Maya reached up, her hands finding his broad shoulders, pulling herself closer. She rose on her tiptoes, pressing her lips against his. Fiercely, utterly, it was a kiss of surrender, of devotion, of absolute, unwavering choice. It wasn't gentle. It was a hungry claiming, a public sealing of their unbreakable bond. She pulled back slowly, her eyes shining, her breath mingling with his. The thick black wedding band, solid and unyielding, gleamed on her finger, no longer a mark of a cold contract, but a powerful symbol of her willing submission, her cherished status, and her absolute undeniable place by his side. She was his, forever. Months had blurred into a new, exhilarating rhythm for Maya. No longer the meticulous corporate event planner from a modest background, she was now Mrs. Volkov, a name that resonated with both awe and a healthy dose of fear in London's elite circles. Her touch, once merely efficient, now carried an undeniable weight, a quiet authority that commanded instant respect. She stood in the grand ballroom of the Royal Albert Hall, surveying the intricate floral arrangements, the perfectly laid tables, the shimmering lights that transformed the space into a dream. This charity gala, her latest design, was flawless, a testament to her meticulous eye and the formidable backing of Victor's empire. A junior assistant, flustered, approached her with a problem regarding a delayed shipment of bespoke linens. Maya listened, her expression calm, her gaze steady. She didn't raise her voice. She simply gave a quiet, precise instruction, her solution cutting through the panic with surgical CL.